Welcome once again to the Upper Room. So good to be with you right away to our location. We seldom film in the same location twice, but from time to time it happens, and it's happening today for a very specific reason. We are pretty much at the end of the runway here in Montrose at this regional airport, which is pretty busy in the winter with all the skiing population coming in and driving on up to Telluride. But we're here because I want to start with what took place almost exactly 3 months ago, January 29th, in fact, at Ronald Reagan Airport. You probably remember this story because it captured the nation's attention for a long period of time. American Airlines Flight 5342 was coming in for landing on runway 33 at Ronald Reagan Airport in Arlington, Virginia, when a Black Hawk helicopter collided with it and 67 people perished at exactly 8:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It was such a tragedy that was caught on film, and so many questions surrounded it for such a long time, and I'm not sure they've still gotten to the bottom of how that could possibly happen. But interestingly, from that moment on, and there was another plane accident just, I think, the next week in Philadelphia, a lot of attention was drawn to the idea that it seemed like all of a sudden we started hearing news that there are a lot of near misses. Unfortunately, that was not a near miss. It would have been great if it had been. But since that time, there have been other plane accidents and a lot of near misses. Some people estimate that hundreds of near misses in any given year around our airports take place. That's important because we're going to talk about near misses today, and our hope is that you won't see a near miss behind us. As I mentioned, we're quite a ways down the runway, so there shouldn't be a lot of activity between airplanes. I noticed today a headline of a news outlet that is sponsored by a very famous broadcaster, podcaster. You'd know his name, you'd recognize it, and the headline that he had said, "Planes are falling out of the sky." And I think that's a bit much. As you know, the news media can kind of overdo it a bit. I don't think planes are falling out of the sky. However, there is this awareness now that for whatever reasons, there's a lot of skepticism as to why it's happening. There are a lot of near misses when you consider how many millions of people fly each day. You know, the numbers of near misses are really not that many, but it doesn't bring comfort to those who want to fly. That's why we're here. Near misses take place in our text today. We're in John chapter 18, and we're going to see some near misses take place. They're certainly of the different variety than the airplane near misses. However, they're even more tragic, if you can believe that. So if you've been keeping up with our lessons, you know that Jesus and his disciples have been in the upper room. They left the upper room, probably went out the east gate, sometimes called Stephen's Gate, and they found their way probably along some vineyards as he taught, continued to teach anyway, in John 15 about him being the vine and his disciples being the branches. And they have continued on down into the Kidron Valley. Somewhere in that span of time, we came upon chapter 17 where Jesus prays, and it was an amazing prayer. We called it Fly on the Wall. We got to be flies on the wall to listen to Jesus talk to his Father in the most intimate and personal way, and so much of that prayer was about us. Certainly it was about his 11 disciples because Judas had been dismissed, full of the devil, truly. But it was about protection for us and promises for us and how we as his disciples, and specifically those 11, would deal with what was about to come. So now we're in the early hours of Friday morning, the day of Jesus' crucifixion. and they have made their way down into the Kidron Valley, and we'll pick that up. We're going to have a few interruptions today. We'll be patient. I'd like to share with you before we go any further, however, that there is one undeniable truth about history and the history of this world. And that truth is this, that the crucifixion of Jesus is the most important event in the history of the world. And so now in our text, we are hours away from that. And what has always been a pretty positive and joyful thing for the disciples, being around Jesus, seeing him heal people and raise the dead and all of that, now it gets dark. Literally it's dark, but it gets really dark emotionally and spiritually for them, for what they're about to experience and what they see that they could never have ever imagined. Jesus had never been physically accosted, even though maybe there were some attempts on his life. Emotionally, spiritually, he'd been under attack the entire time they knew him. But now that shifts, and we're about to see something that they could never have dreamed would happen. Remember, they accepted him as Messiah, which in their minds meant he will reign. He will be king on this earth. He will free our nation from Rome. He wins. But in these moments, it doesn't feel like that to them. Now, as we look at the crucifixion of Jesus and what led up to it, you could call the crucifixion a crime scene, and any sleuth worth his or her weight would want to know who was involved in this. Was it just one person? Were a lot of people that were involved in this conspiracy? Well, Jesus was not shocked and he was not surprised by what was taking place. I take you to Matthew 26:1. Jesus said, "As you know, the Passover is 2 days away, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." Could it be any plainer than that? He's just telling them, this is what you need to prepare for. Verse 3 then goes on to say, "Then the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest. His name was Caiaphas." We'll talk more about Caiaphas. "And they schemed to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him." It is a conspiracy to murder Jesus. After Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, John chapter 11, we read this. "Then one of them," meaning the Jewish leaders, the high priest in particular, Caiaphas, who was the high priest, spoke up. "You all know nothing. You don't realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than the whole nation perish." He didn't realize he was actually prophesying what would happen. He was playing right into God's hands. But what he was saying is, this guy is causing so much havoc that we're all in trouble if we don't get rid of him. And so the conspiracy was well in place before early Friday morning. And that passage finishes in verse 53 by saying, "So from that day on, they plotted to take his life." Acts chapter 4, we pick up the early church praying. And in verse 24, they begin that prayer, but then they say something I think you need to hear, because if we're thinking that this was all just about a few people conspiring, there's more to the story. Verse 24 of chapter 4, they, the early church, raised their voices together in prayer to God. "Sovereign Lord," they said, "you made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them." That's a great way to start a prayer, isn't it? But you go down to verse 27, and now they get very specific about what they experienced. And they say this, "Indeed, Herod and Pontius Pilate met together with the Gentiles and the people of Israel in this very city to conspire against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed." Wow, in that prayer, they name both Rome and Israel and all the major influential players as conspiring together. So is that what happened to put Jesus on the cross? Their prayer goes on in verse 28, and they pray this, "They did what your power and will had decided beforehand should happen." In other words, they were just bit players in your amazing play. in your amazing story. Now, if we back up to chapter 2, verse 23, where Peter is preaching his first sermon, he says, God knew what would happen, and his prearranged plan was carried out when Jesus was betrayed. With the help of lawless Gentiles, you nailed him to a cross and killed him. He's talking to tens of thousands of Jewish people there. And so we find this intriguing blend of human activity and sovereign will of God. In fact, John MacArthur puts it this way: the cross is therefore the ultimate proof of the utter sovereignty of God. His purposes are always fulfilled in spite of the evil intentions of sinners. And so we have sovereign will of God, human participation, creating the perfect storm or the perfect story. Which is it? As we've said so many times, Jesus is always, always, always right. That sounds obvious. There's probably no one in our faith communities that would argue with that reality. But then I wonder why we live the way we do if we believe that Jesus is always right. Let me give you some examples. Matthew 17:22. After they gathered again in Galilee, Jesus told them, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of his enemies. He will be killed. But on the third day, he'll be raised from the dead. And the disciples were filled with grief. Probably more confusion. What? How could that possibly be? He just predicted every detail of what was about to happen. So as you can see, Jesus, although by appearances may seem to be the victim of these people conspiring to murder him, he's actually in complete control, as he always is. He is no victim. He has known since the foundations of the earth, before any of this was here, that this plan was set, and it would involve his participation in a very painful but meaningful way. Again, to reiterate that Jesus is in control, John chapter 10, verse 17, he says, I sacrifice my life so I may take it back again. No one can take my life from me. I sacrifice it voluntarily, for I have the authority to lay it down when I want and also to take it up again, for this is what my Father has commanded. Okay, so we see now exactly the reality of the situation. That although people conspired and people hated him and they wanted him dead, they're only playing small roles in his enormous, perfect plan. Now, here's what we're going to do. We know God's hand is on this event. We know it's going to unfold just as precisely as he wants it to. But I want to shift our focus for a little bit from what God is doing to the human participation in this. So now we'll change our focus from what God is doing to what the human participation looks like, and we're going to call it swing and a miss. A swing and a miss. If you're familiar with baseball and you listen to broadcasts of games or watch telecasts of games, you will hear that phrase more times than you can count. A swing and a miss. And the reason for that is because baseball is so hard that the best players in the world only hit the ball 30% of the time. And so they do a lot of swing and miss. So you'll hear it again and again, a swing and a miss, a swing and a miss. And that's what we see amongst the human participation in this extravagant masterpiece of the last hours of Jesus' life. A lot of swing and miss. And so I want to show you at least one literal swing and miss. We'll unpack that quite a bit, and then we're going to kind of breeze through the rest of the chapter, and I would implore you to go deeper into the rest of the chapter on your own. It's the trials of Jesus, but for now, the arrest of Jesus, we see a literal swing and a miss, and then we'll talk about some figurative swing and misses. In the literal swing and miss that takes place, I'm going to give you 5 key words, okay? If you want to just latch onto these 5 words to understand the different parts of this literal swing and miss, and that is right there at the arrest of Jesus, then jot these down. Okay, here we go. John chapter 18, verse 1. When he had finished praying, we just talked about that high priestly prayer, right? That was the Lord's Prayer, the true Lord's Prayer, The Sermon on the Mount was not the Lord's Prayer. That was the disciples' prayer that he taught. So when he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. Okay, I mentioned this in the last lesson, but in case you missed it, it is significant and worth repeating. And that is this. Based on the historian Josephus, who 30 years later actually kept track of how many lambs were sacrificed in the temple at Passover, and the number he came up with after counting them diligently was 256,000 lambs in about a day and a half period of time. Can you imagine? They were absolutely slaughtered, and the blood by the thousands of gallons poured down into the temple and into some channels, and then out and down the hill in the back of the temple and into the Kidron Valley, where there is a brook, there's a stream, what they would call a wadi. And that wadi during the rainy seasons was filled with just rainwater. But in this moment, it is just bright red with blood. The blood of hundreds of thousands of lambs. And it is at the bottom of that little valley that they cross now. And as they kind of jump across that wadi or find their way across it, don't you think that Jesus looked down at that blood and thought, none of that blood will do what my blood will do in a few hours? How significant is this? So we go on in verse 1, and it says, on the other side there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. We'll talk about that garden in a moment. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place. That's key, because Jesus had often met with his disciples there. All right, what garden was this? As they climbed the Mount of Olives, there were many gardens that were filled with trees, olive trees. We know from the other accounts by the gospel writers that this was the Garden of Gethsemane. The word Gethsemane means oil press. And it's significant then that Jesus would enter into the Garden of Gethsemane, into a place where the squeezing and the pressing of the olives was commonplace, and now the pressure is on Jesus and his disciples. But it's a real significant place. As the text mentioned, Judas knew all about this place. Now, if you went back to John chapter 7 and read the last verse of John chapter 7, you'd see that John records that everybody went to their home. After a time of teaching, everybody went to their homes. Chapter 8, verse 1 says Jesus went to the Garden of Gethsemane, as though that was his home. If he wasn't in Bethany with Mary and Martha and Lazarus, this was he and the disciples' home away from home. Remember, Jesus said, are you sure you want to follow the Son of Man? Because the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. I don't actually have a home. It seems as though the Garden of Gethsemane was one of their places. So that's the word for this section. The place. The place. Do you have a place? They had a place. And it was so common that they went to that place. Now, the garden itself was made up of many gardens. Many people owned them. They would sometimes put stone fences around them, gates there, and maybe even lock them up to keep intruders out. So it seems as though Jesus and his disciples had a relationship with one of these gardeners, one of these farmers, and they allowed them to use it quite a bit. That's how Jesus knows where to go. Jesus doesn't go to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he hasn't been going to the Garden of Gethsemane just because, they serve good milkshakes. He went there on purpose and set a habit of doing that so that when the right time came, he knew where Judas would be able to find him. You see, Jesus, did I mention he's not a victim? He did not run from this. He actually moves forward into it on purpose. Every step, every moment is planned. And he knows that Judas knows where to find them. This is remarkable, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But this is the place, and it's significant. Okay, let's move on to verse 3. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Other accounts specify clubs. They're coming with torches and lanterns, swords, and clubs. Now, what's a detachment or a cohort? That would be between 600 and 1,000 soldiers. So it says they brought a cohort. It could have been 600 to 1,000 soldiers. If it was something they just called a maniple, that would be 200. There was a combination of Roman soldiers and Jewish temple guards. Anywhere from 200 to 1,000. And as they came, can you imagine the people that watched this enormous group of soldiers move to the Garden of Gethsemane, and people probably joined them? There is likely close to 1,000 people coming into the garden right now. Discussion question: why do you think they brought that many soldiers? And why do you think they brought weapons, swords, clubs, lanterns, torches? Just to grab a 33-year-old carpenter from Nazareth? Well, I hope that wasn't that difficult of a question for you, because if you remember, Jesus had proven how powerful he was. They'd seen him cleanse the temple in the beginning of his ministry, and then just in this week prior to this night, he had cleansed the temple again. He had run everyone out of the temple. That was seen by everyone. They knew he was powerful. They feared him. They thought, we'll need maybe 500 to 1,000 soldiers to take him. We'll need torches, because we also know this: he'll run. When he sees us coming, he'll run. He'll try to hide. We'll have to have light to find him. They didn't know Jesus, did they? On to verse 4. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" Don't miss that little detail. He's not running. He's not hiding. This is going as planned. He went toward them, asked them. Obviously, you are here to arrest someone. Whose name is on the warrant for you to arrest? The next word, the first one was the place. The next word is one you probably have never used this way, but it's the word plucky. Have you ever heard the word plucky? It's a great word. It actually means courageous, brave, bold. How courageous is Jesus? There's an army of maybe 1,000 soldiers coming just to get him. And he walks right towards them, and he initiates the conversation. Boy, if you think for a second that Jesus was this mamby-pamby, milquetoast pacifist that would never said anything to anybody and hid from people, introvert, scared of his own shadow, look at that passage again. And so he says, "Who is it you have come for?" They respond. Whoever's in charge of this enormous group of soldiers, this army, responds, "Jesus of Nazareth." And then Jesus does this. He says, "I am he." You need to hear this. When he says, "I am he," the word "he" is not in there. He responds with, "I am." In the Greek, it was ego eimi. I am. Remember, we've talked about this. It's the same title, the title of God that he used of himself. I am the gate. I am the bread. I am the light, and on and on. And he says it again. And now watch what happens when the Son of God says, "I am God." We pick it up in verse 6, and it says, when Jesus said, "I am," they drew back and fell to the ground. Like dominoes, hundreds of soldiers are blown away. Wouldn't that have been something to see? I cannot emphasize how much Jesus is in complete control. It looked like things were getting out of control. The disciples have got to be thinking, oh my, this is taking a terrible turn, a turn for the worst. He blows them all down. Is this pretty consistent with who Jesus is? Absolutely. In Mark chapter 1, he's in a synagogue, and a man with a demon, possessed by a demon, comes into the synagogue, and he says this to Jesus: "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." That's a demon. You and I would run for the hills if we were faced with a demon speaking to us. And yet the demon speaks to him, and the demon is scared to death. I know who you are. I know your name. And Jesus' response to him is, be quiet and get out. The word he actually used is be muzzled. Have you ever seen a dog muzzled? Be muzzled. Shut your mouth and get out. And he did. And that's the power we're talking about. And that's the word for this section of Scripture. The power of Jesus is beyond description. John 1:4, the Word, meaning Jesus, John calls him the Word, gave life to everything that was created. So by his Word, everything was created. Of course, in Colossians 1:15, we get the summary of who Jesus is. Christ is the visible image of the invisible God. Thus, the series we've been in forever, right? The expression, he expresses God. He's supreme over all creation. Through him, God created everything. God used him to create all things. Everything was created through him and for him. He holds all creation together. The power is indescribable, unimaginable. And these soldiers, these people, get to experience it firsthand. Isaiah chapter 11 is a prophecy about Jesus. Verse 4 says, he will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. With the breath of his lips, he will slay the wicked. In Revelation chapter 19, verse 11, when he returns, he comes riding on a white horse, and his name is Faithful and True, and he wages a righteous war. He wore a robe dipped in blood, and his title was the Word of God. From his mouth came a sharp sword to strike down the nations, and he'll rule them with an iron rod. And on the side of his thigh is tattooed, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. They just met him. I don't know if you've ever heard of Annie Dillard. She's a Pulitzer Prize winning novelist. And she said this, I think it's so intriguing. I really don't know a lot about her, but she's talking about the idea of Jesus and who he is in the Scriptures. And she says, does anyone have the foggiest idea of what sort of power we so blithely invoke? The word blithely, if you're not sure about that, is casually, with such indifference. And we do. Hey, Jesus, do we know how powerful that name is? Or, as I suspect, she goes on, does no one believe a word of it? That's a great question, isn't it? When you read what we just read, Jesus says, I am. And hundreds, if not 1,000 soldiers are blown on their backs. Do you believe that? Or do you go, it sounds like, kind of an exaggeration. No, it's true to his nature. It's consistent with what he's been doing his entire time on the earth, calming the seas, healing the blind, raising the dead. It's who he is. He is power. Going on, verse 7 says again, he asked them, who is it you want? Get up, get up. Okay, who is it you want again? Jesus of Nazareth, they said. And in verse 8, Jesus answers, I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go. Let my disciples go. This happened, John writes, so that the words he had spoken earlier would be fulfilled. The words from his high priestly prayer in chapter 17, Father, I have not lost one of those you gave me. It is fulfilled. It happens again. Let them go. They will be let go. The word that comes to mind here is protector. He is the great protector. So much of what he said in the upper room and in his prayer was about protecting those who belong to him, and he's protecting them still. Can you imagine? If you were in that situation, wouldn't you be thinking just about yourself? Okay, now I said this is the literal swing and miss. Here we go. Verse 10. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. There's only 2 names in this whole episode. In the garden, the arrest. Malchus, the servant of the high priest. And why is he there? He's there because Jesus is going to do one last miracle. As Jesus, Luke tells us, puts the ear back on. And Judas is mentioned. Why? Because he's a scoundrel. He's demon-possessed. He's as evil as you get. He will come up and he will kiss Jesus. Not kissing his feet like a servant or his hand, kissing his cheek like an equal, like a friend. So Jesus responds to Peter, verse 11. Peter, put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. In our next lesson, we will talk about the cup. Just to let you know, in case you missed the next lesson, it is the cup of the wrath of God, the judgment of God. Jesus has been arrested now, and that part of John 18 is over, but not without one more word for you: perspective. I believe that's what Jesus is telling Peter. Peter, get some perspective here. You think this is about you standing up for me? That's not part of the plan. I don't need you to do that. There's a much bigger story going on than you know about. And so that's the literal swing and a miss. Peter swings his sword and he misses. I'm sure he was aiming for his head, but Malchus was pretty quick. Only gets an ear. A swing and a miss, literally. But now we get into the figurative swing and misses, and that will include Peter as well. Here we go, verse 15. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple who was known to the high priest, we don't know who this is, by the way, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. The servant girl says to Peter, "You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you?" He replied, "I am not." A servant girl, the lowliest of low-ranking human beings in their society, and he's intimidated. Jump to verse 25 now. Okay, we'll come back to that section, but we'll go on to verse 25. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself, so they asked him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. "Didn't I see you with him in the garden? Yeah, you're the one that's not very good aim with your sword." Again, Peter denied it, and at that very moment a rooster began to crow. First, Peter had a literal swing and miss with a sword. Now he has a huge, much more devastating swing and miss in denying Jesus 3 times. Had he had any warning? Had he had any premonition? Had he had any pre-activity with Jesus? We do pre-activity, always did with our kids, and now sometimes with grandkids. Pre-activity is, okay, here's where we're going, and here's what we're going to be doing, and here's what you need to know, and here's how you need to behave. That's pre-activity. Did Peter have any of that? I take you to Luke chapter 22, verse 31. "Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift each of you like wheat." That's a great translation there. Other translations simply put it, Jesus says to him, "Simon, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat." But the you is plural, so it's all of y'all. It's y'all. Peter, Satan has come to me and asked permission. That's how powerful Jesus is. Satan has to ask permission. And he's asked to sift you all, mess with you, make your lives painful and difficult. And he says he's going to do it to all of you. And then Jesus goes on and says, "But I have pleaded in prayer for you, Simon, that your faith would not fail. So when you have repented and returned to me again, strengthen your brothers." Wow, you will fall. And you'll need to repent. You'll need to change your mind about what you're about to do. That's pre-activity. That's premonition. I had the story right up front and I ignored it if I'm Peter. Verse 33, Peter said, "Lord, I'm ready to go to prison with you. I'll even die with you." Can you say machoism? Can you say male ego? I got you. I got your 6. I'm with you. I'll die with you. Come on. That's bold, brash, audacious, arrogant Peter. And yet we are now getting a glimpse of the real Peter, aren't we? On the night that Jesus is arrested. And it is then that Jesus said to Peter, "Peter, Peter, before the rooster crows, you will have denied me 3 times. Jesus, surprise, he's right. He's right again. He's always right. When will we get that in our thick skulls? That Jesus is always right, and he was right about Peter, and Peter just must have ignored it. Maybe Peter should have fallen then at the feet of Jesus and said, please forgive me if I do such a thing. I will make my whole life about not doing that. I don't know, but he knew it was coming, and he still stepped right at it. In Matthew 26, they're on their way to the garden. Just hours before, Jesus told them, tonight all of you will desert me. For the scriptures say God will strike the shepherd and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. That's a prophecy out of Zechariah chapter 13 verse 7. God will strike the shepherd. Figure that one out. It is God who is making this happen. He's using a bunch of foolish people, but he's making it happen. And it says, when I strike the shepherd, his sheep will scatter. So Jesus has been arrested, they've taken him back into the city, and now 6 mock trials, 6 illegal trials will now take place over the next couple hours. And I've said that a long time, but I've never actually articulated to you why they were illegal trials. So let me run through them really quick. 7 reasons why these were illegal, and for rule keepers like the Pharisees, Sadducees, teachers of the law, the Sanhedrin, the chief priest, boy, they had to really spit in the face of law to let this happen. But they were willing. Desperate times, desperate measures. Here they are. The first reason was there's no trial that was supposed to be held during the feast time. Passover is a feast time. There's to be no trials going on. Number 2, each member of the court was to vote individually to convict or acquit, but Jesus was convicted by acclamation. That is, let's just all vote. They weren't individuals voting. Number 3, if the death penalty was given, a night must pass before the sentence was carried out. However, only a few hours passed before Jesus is placed on the cross. Number 4, the Jews had no authority to execute anyone, and that's what they tell Pilate. You're going to have to do this because we can't do it. But they see to it that it happens. Number 5, no trial was to be held at night. This trial was held purely at night. Number 6, the accused was to be given counsel or representation. Jesus had none, although we know he had the Spirit who was counseling him. Number 7, finally, the accused was not to be asked self-incriminating questions, but Jesus was asked if he was the Christ. Okay, they broke all kinds of rules to make sure they got rid of this troublemaker. So the first trial, they take him to Annas and Caiaphas. Let me explain, do a little history with you. Annas is the former high priest. Caiaphas is the present high priest, but the former high priest still has authority. And oh, by the way, Annas is Caiaphas's father-in-law, which we find to be the case with the high priest, assigned by Rome to be high priest. It was a political position more than anything else, often purchased with certain amounts of money, often as a political favor, and you can see the politics in this, right? Annas says, I want my son-in-law to be the next high priest, so they assign Caiaphas to be the next high priest. Caiaphas will reign as high priest for over 20 years, which is an extraordinary amount of time. When they finally oust him, the next guy that comes in to take his place lasts 50 days. There were only, in a matter of 100 years of Rome being in charge of Israel, there were only about 26 high priests during that time. So Caiaphas' longevity was remarkable, but he was as corrupt, as wealthy as any of them or all of them. That's who Jesus comes before. First it's Annas, the father-in-law, and then his son-in-law Caiaphas. So with these players, we're going to run right through it, and I can say much about it. Verse 19, meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus said, I have spoken openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews came together. I said nothing in secret. There's no secrecy going on here. It's been out in the open. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said. He's asking for witnesses. Do you think he's going to get any witnesses? When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face and said, is that the way you talk to the high priest? After being slapped in the face, Jesus said, hey, if I said something wrong, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why do you strike me? And then Annas says, enough, sends him to Caiaphas. The other accounts talk about that trial. Now it comes before Pilate. Pilate, you need to know, is the governor of that area. Now Pilate, as governor for Rome, was sent there to govern Palestine, and that was not a lofty assignment. It was like being sent to El Paso, Texas. Nothing against El Paso, Texas, but if you've ever been there, it's not really where you long to go. And typically, Pilate would be on the coast, a nice coastal town, Caesarea, nice view of the Mediterranean Sea. When times of festival happened in Israel, he would come inland to Jerusalem, and there at a place called Fort Antonia, he and his soldiers, of which there were probably 600, would look over the Jewish temple courts and make sure nobody got out of control. That's why Pilate is there. That's the time of year he would come. He would normally be there. He wouldn't want to be there. And so Jesus is brought before Pilate. So we're on to verse 28. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor, Fort Antonia. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" And they responded, "If you weren't a criminal, we wouldn't have brought him to you." But Pilate said, "Take him yourself and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anybody. We want him dead." And John says this took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. The Romans have to put him to death on a cross. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus asked him, "Is this your idea, or did others talk to you about me?" Pilate responds a little impatiently, "Am I a Jew? Your own people and chief priests hand you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus responds, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest from the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," Pilate says. Jesus answers, "You say that I'm a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into this world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." What a statement. As you can tell, we're flying over most of this stuff at the end. Go back to that statement. Everyone who wants truth listens to me. If you want truth about life, about this world, about the realities of things here, listen to Jesus. So that's Pilate. Now the crowd is going to chime in. And most likely this crowd is a bunch of agitators, probably paid to be there. Can you relate to that? Our media tells us protests are popping up. No, those are just agitators that are being paid to do that. Most likely that's what's going on here. Pilate says, "What is truth?" Famously, "What is truth?" And then he went out to the Jews gathered there. He says, "I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." And then John adds his commentary. Now Barabbas, who was he? He had taken part in an uprising, in an insurrection. He should have been put to death for that. That's what Rome did with anyone who did that. And so the crowd, the agitators, the paid screamers scream for Jesus to be murdered. So is this a big shock? Are you shocked at how this played out? You probably know the story. You weren't surprised by it. John chapter 1, verse 10. He, meaning Jesus, came into the very world he created. Isn't that incredible? He created the world and then he came into it. But the world didn't recognize him. He came to his own people and they even rejected him. John's conclusion at the beginning of his story of Jesus is two things. Number one, they didn't recognize him. They will not recognize him. And number two, they will reject him. Can you say swing and miss? That's what that is describing. That's a swing and a miss. You had the Son of God there in your presence, before you, speaking to you, doing miracles, and you missed it. You didn't recognize him. You rejected him. Swing and miss. Swing and miss. But John goes on. But to all who believed in him and accepted him, he gave them the right to become children of God. And so most of the people reject Jesus, even today. They at least don't recognize him, but there is a remnant who doesn't reject him, who does recognize him. And we are that remnant, and we choose to replace, get this, replace ourselves as the master of our lives with him becoming Lord and Master. And that's what we have here. And that, while the two other groups are swinging and missing, when it comes to the Son of God, that's a big hit when we realize, I'm going to let you replace me as boss of my life. We relish that reality, that having Jesus replace us, each one of us, as Lord. Because, to be honest with you, most of our lives, we're Lord of our lives. We're boss. Having him replace us, and then in turn, becoming children of God. What an honor. We are coming upon the 26th anniversary of an event here in Colorado that changed the world forever, really. April 20th of 1999, Eric Harris, an 18-year-old, and Dylan Klebold, a 17-year-old, entered Columbine High School. That's on the other side of the mountains in the Denver area. They entered that high school and they proceeded to murder 12 students and a teacher. And they wounded 21 other people. Two of those students who were murdered that day by Harris and Klebold were two girls, one by the name of Rachel Scott, and the other's name was Cassie Burnell. And their stories became very well known. Both of them had books written about them. Specifically, Cassie Burnell, her mom wrote a book about her life and what happened that day. And people have said these two girls were martyrs because, as the story goes, Klebold and Harris pointed their guns at these girls and said, "Do you believe in God?" And when they said yes, they murdered them. Now, it won't surprise you to know that the modern secular media has jumped into those stories in the last many years, and they have tried to minimize, at least, or possibly snuff out any hint that these two girls stood for their faith in God, and that's what cost them their lives. But those who were there claim that's what happened. And in the book about Cassie Burnell, her mom talks about how she was no angel. In fact, she said she was confused, insecure, alienated, sometimes bitter, insecure about her appearances. She tried to fit in, even to the wrong groups. But she said, but that yes that she said about her belief in God, that had been her yes to God for the previous weeks and months of her life. Through all the difficulties she went through and the challenges and the heartache for her mom and those who knew her, in the previous weeks and months, she started saying yes to God. She started this loving relationship with the God of the universe. And I love how her mom put it. Her yes that day had been yes the previous weeks and months. That's her story. Is it a stretch to say that Cassie Burnell was a modern day Peter? I don't think so. I think she had a lot of swing and misses. You know, Peter had a lot of swing and misses. We just read about them. But in the end, when it came down to the moment, history tells us that Peter was crucified upside down. Didn't want to be crucified the same way, in the same method exactly as his Lord, because he wasn't worthy. He'd become a very humble man. You can see that when Jesus talked to him after the resurrection. He wasn't that same arrogant, filled with bravado man that we see there on the way into the garden. Eventually, Peter took a swing, and he had a hit. And it was a big hit, wasn't it? As was the case with Cassie Burnell. Her last swing was a home run. I'll tell you what, there are a lot of people. We just went through them all, right? Annas and Caiaphas and the crowd and Pilate. They all took swings and misses. They had the Son of God right in front of them. Swing and miss, swing and miss, swing and miss. How about you? Are you fully aware of Jesus' presence in your life? Do you recognize it? Have you ever been tempted to reject him? Or have you become part of the remnant of those of us who absolutely have handed our lives over to him and realized that he needs to replace us when it comes to running our lives? As you can tell, we kind of skimmed the surface of that incredible event, the arrest of Jesus, the trials of Jesus. But there's enough here, I think, for you to begin to meditate on who would you have been that night, in that crowd, in that garden. We know who God was. He planned it down to the very detail because he's always in charge. Thanks for joining us. We love you. Love doing this journey with you, even though it's not as fast as an airplane. God bless you.